Thank you. Muchas gracias. Hola to everybody. Those are the only few words that I've learned in the past few days. I think, having seen the messages that were already screened, we realize that the past centuries, the late 19th century, the early 20th century was characterized by wars, destruction, and lots of loss of life. Thereafter, what we saw is scramble for Africa, where people came in and took over many countries and colonized them. And so one of the legacies that many of us from the South carry is the legacy of colonialism. Mahatma Gandhi was a victim of the colonial legacy as well. He was born in India, but he spent almost 21 years in South Africa. He came to South Africa in 1893, and I just want to quote from his writings what he said about South Africa. He said that, and I quote, "I had gone to South Africa for travel and for gaining my own livelihood, because he came there as a lawyer representing a trader in a law case. But I found myself in search of God and striving for self-realization." So it was in South Africa that he managed to realize his true self and transformed into the Mahatma that we know, that most of us know. But when he came to South Africa, he was just an ordinary person like you and I. And it's the circumstances that changed his life and that made him realize the purpose of life and the purpose that he was born in this world for. And this realization came to him in South Africa. Whilst in South Africa, he experimented with a number of different issues. Firstly, he began to realize that violence is not the way to deal with conflicts. That conflicts are there in the world. There is a lot of dissatisfaction. He saw this. There was a lot of injustice. He saw this in the colonial legacy. But to deal with it, we have to use nonviolent means. And he began to experiment on the different ways in which you can use nonviolent strategies. Now, nonviolent strategies are not passive strategies. It was at one time called passive resistance, but he opposed that and said that nonviolent strategies are in fact very active and require a lot of courage, because to stand and face a gun without being armed, to stand in front of a gun requires courage. To stand there and not move when they are telling you that we are going to shoot requires a lot of courage. And that is the kind of courage that nonviolent strategies require. And this is what Gandhiji began to experiment with in South Africa. He left South Africa with that legacy of nonviolence and then took it to India, where they perfected it. And one of the big movements in India was the Salt March, which a lot of people would have read about in 1930, when he gathered hundreds of millions of people to walk and to make their own salt, to boycott Western cloth, to go out and strike and demonstrate in a non-violent way. The whole of India was out on the streets. And the British then had to give in to Gandhiji's demands, to the country's demands for freedom. And that was the beginning of the freedom that India eventually was able to attain. In South Africa, likewise, Mandela and many other people before Mandela, like Chief Albert Luthuli, who was the first recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, first Black recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, was a person who was dedicated to a nonviolent strategy for attaining freedom in South Africa. For a while, Mandela began to think that, this government is so intransigent that peaceful means are not going to help us, and so took to violent means. But whilst he was in Robben Island, he read Gandhi's works, and he began to see the need for peaceful transformation. So Mandela also carries the legacy of peaceful transformation, because that is what he eventually did in South Africa, as a result of which South Africa, which was a country which nobody in the 80s felt, or early 90s even believed, that the apartheid government would eventually relent to the majority of the people and sit at the same table and discuss a peaceful solution for South Africa. No one in the world would believe that that could happen, but it did happen. It was like a miracle that happened in 1990 when Nelson Mandela was released from Robben Island. All the people of South Africa who were in exile came back into the country and sat and negotiated a peaceful settlement. As was said earlier, peace isn't just a signing of a document. We came up with the Constitution and we had a change of government, but that doesn't mean that peace has been established. Peace requires a lot of work, and we saw this, and therefore we established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, whereby we gave an opportunity to those people who had committed atrocities against the people to come there and tell the truth. And then there would be an amnesty for those people who had repented, and there would be reparations for those people who were victims. But the first act would be to come out and confess. Now, that was a difficult time in the history of the country. We had many stories, many stories of real suffering of the people told at that time. People were given an opportunity to tell their own stories, and then the perpetrators came there and told their stories, confessed that this is what they had done. But even then, at this time in our country, we still face the challenge of how forgiveness and how reconciliation can take place in the country. And this is still an ongoing challenge. It is work in progress in our country, and we are trying very hard to bring about that change in the country whereby the people can become, like Archbishop Tutu said, a rainbow nation where everybody could be one, could embrace one nationality and not think of themselves as different race groups or as different people in one country. We want to build a South African nation, a South African community in South Africa, and that is the work that we are busy doing at this moment. I think that you in Colombia face the same challenge, and that is the same thing that the South-South Cooperation Council is trying to do here in Colombia and elsewhere, so that we can work together. Because even when we, got apartheid government to come to the table, when Nelson Mandela was able to achieve a peaceful solution to the community, it wasn't just Nelson Mandela alone. There were 4 very important strategies that were undertaken by the community, by the people of South Africa, and by the international community. So the one strategy was the mass democratic struggle in the country, where all the oppressed people of the country came together united as a group and protested peacefully in the country for change. So they applied pressure on the apartheid government to come to the table. So this was the mass democratic movement within the country. Outside the country, we had 2 movements. One comprised of world communities. Many countries in the world supported the struggle of the South Africans. And they supported it through forming anti-apartheid committees in all the different countries. You had anti-apartheid movements. And these movements supported us, the struggle in South Africa, through boycotts and through anti-apartheid organizations, whereby any South African who came into their countries would be shunned. That South African would feel ashamed for the apartheid system that existed in South Africa. They would boycott South African products. They would boycott South African sports until the Sports Council had to say, we are not going to allow South Africa to participate. They would boycott culture, South African cultural organizations to come there until, South Africa was completely isolated from the international community. They were not able to trade with the international community. They were not able to participate in culture, in sports. And when the country felt the pain and shame of being isolated, they then agreed to come to the table. So the anti-apartheid movements, and these movements comprised of people from all over the world, people of different countries who supported us, the oppressed people of South Africa. And that is how we managed to get a peaceful solution in South Africa. There were 2 other armed struggles as well. There was the armed South African army, which was in exile and applied pressure through armed struggle. There was also an internal underground movement that also assisted in their own way to promote to ensure that the South African government comes to the table. And so those were the 4 different strategies that we in the struggle applied, 4 strategies. And through that, we managed to get freedom in South Africa. But freedom is not the end. As Nelson Mandela said, there's still a long walk to freedom. And that long walk means equity in the country where everyone has access to education, to healthcare, to livelihood, and so on. Get rid of poverty in the country and have a better life for all. And this is what we are still striving for. We also need to get rid of the apartheid racial policies, which in the past were officially run by the government, but at the moment they are not official, but there are lots of people who still have racism in their mind, who still feel that white is superior to black. And that takes a long time to get rid of. But we are trying. Through various processes, we are trying to change the people's mindsets in South Africa so that we can live as one South African nation, to build a South African nation. And that is the challenge that we face in South Africa. We are trying to do this through nonviolent means because we believe that nonviolent means can help to achieve a lot more than violent means can help to achieve. Violence destroys. There is a lot of destruction when we use violence. Environmental destruction, destruction of lives. Gandhiji has shown us that the non-violent way is a better way. And therefore, we are looking at non-violent strategies to improve the condition in the country. Now, I believe you here in Colombia and many countries of the South face similar challenges. And by coming together, we can overcome these challenges and bring about an equitable society, a society where everybody has access to the basic necessities of life. The basic necessities of life, which are housing, food, security, comfort, education, healthcare, and so on. Nobody has to be without those kinds of facilities. And that is the kind of society that we want to achieve. Through the South-South cooperation, we will be able to achieve that kind of a society. And that is what we together can begin to look at and develop. And that is what I have come here to see. And I'm hoping that with the cooperation of the people over here, that we will be able to build every community, whether it is Colombia, the Philippines, every country in the world, including South Africa, would be able to achieve that kind of a better life for everyone. Better life for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam Ela, because you have really provided a perspective of how through the South-South Cooperation Council, we can reinforce our common desire, our vision for peace. Indeed, I would like to follow up on her nonviolence approach. Definitely, violence begets violence. So, what is, as an artist, our um, nonviolent approach? It is through arts, because arts affirms life. War is destruction, loss of lives, absolute devastation, and trauma that remains in the consciousness of the victims of war. I would like to focus first on something that I believe all of you have witnessed, although some are very young here. We had a peaceful overthrow of a dictatorship that was violating human rights, uh, plundering the wealth of the nation, and pretending that it is working for the welfare of the people, yet more than 70,000 are registered as victims of the terroristic attacks. Up to now, there are still desaparecidos, families that are still in angst for their lost loved ones. Besides those who have perished in prison, our family likewise had suffered. In order to fight, my husband fought for the restoration of democracy in the Philippines. And because he was a major leader of the opposition overseas, his brother in the Philippines was tortured, eyes pierced, head bashed, tongue cut. That's the cruelty of a dictatorship. But our people survived this dictatorship in a similar way that happened in South Africa. We utilized connectivity with other nations in order to expose the violations of human rights. In the US Congress, in the UN community, particularly in the US Congress, because the dictatorship was being supported by American funds. The army that was keeping him in power was getting all of the funds, most of the funds, through US aid. And so the struggle was in the Congress to expose that the dictator Marcos is not the solution. He is the problem by oppressing people. And it meant continuous dialogue, persuasion, exposition of all of the details of the cruelty of the regime. And because of this power grab, people were more impoverished because money was being stolen from the nation's coffers, used for buildings in the Fifth Avenue, in all sorts of things, jewelry by Mrs. Marcos, great paintings, etc. So this constant expose, constant use also of media, because there was no media, free media in a dictatorship. It was important to reveal the truth. South Africa said they had the Truth and Justice Commission. That was what was lacking in the Philippines when we won peacefully. You must have seen that while the army tanks were there and they were ready to disseminate the people protesting and surrounding those who would stand up against dictatorship, There were nuns and priests with their rosaries offering flowers. There was food coming in for the people that surrounded the camp. And we showed to the world a glorious moment where a dictatorship or a bad government for 20 years was overthrown because the people had the courage to stand up. And that courage, which was somehow submerged, came out when also visibly one of the opposition leaders, Ninoy Aquino, was brutally assassinated in the airport. And when people came out for the funeral, 2 million, courage is contagious. It is important that even one person stands up and you can really immerse this kind of courage with everyone. This is the positive contamination of courage. So it's no different from the struggle of South Africa for liberation. But more so, to go back in the past, war has damaged us, not just war damaging us, but colonialism from Spanish to Japanese to American. But again, the continuous struggle. Finally, America is returning the Balanghiga bells. This was one church with the bells that was used for the Filipino rebels to, in a sense, get even with the Americans occupying the province. And in anger, the Americans, in revenge, killed most of the men, even children, to get even. And they took the bells as their booty. And it has been more than 100 years, almost 100 years, arguing, debating. My husband, as a senator, went to the Warren base in Cheyenne to get or ask the generals, the State Department, until our president finally in the State Nation address said, "Hey, America, return our bells. That's our heritage." Heritage is something so important. Colonialism has submerged our indigenous heritage, the wealth of our cultural traditions. Our indigenous communities were more than 300 all over the islands. Now it is 110. And with the liberation from our dictatorship, we are spreading appreciation and pride in our heritage, in our habitat, in including the traditions of 110 ethnic groups in the culturescape of our country. So it is so important that we work for peace. I mean, you can fight repression, you can fight dictatorship or tyranny, even terrorism now, through active nonviolence. And as an artist, we established or organized in the Philippines under UNESCO patronage the global launch of an international peace movement, not by force, but by art, not by guns, but by persuasion. Through arts where you can conscientize people, where you can expand the consciousness of people, when you can motivate a mindset from cruelty, from greed to caring and compassion. So it is so important that now we are here in Cartagena with the SSCC continuing from Manila here in Cartagena to provide a reflection, a perspective of the creative initiatives within the Latin American region. So I just want to say we must hate war, because they say it's not good to keep hatred when you're talking about forgiveness. But forgiveness cannot come without the complement of justice, where truth must really be unfolded, where contrition and restitution occurs so that we can easily reconcile. But right now, the condition in the Philippines has been a little bit amazing, weird, that after throwing out the dictatorship, the entire clan comes back into power because they still have the billions stolen. And money politics is now working. And money politics allows for more corruption. So we have to stand up, and we are glad. Just recently I got the news that finally, after so many decades, Imelda Marcos has been declared guilty by our court. That is a tremendous celebration. That was a tremendous persuasion, the continuing voice of dissent, that you cannot allow crime to remain unpunished, because that will encourage more perversion in society. So I'd like to just say, you, the young now, haven't really experienced war, but you must be able to empathize with the agony of war-torn countries. I feel very strongly about getting rid of war, ending armed conflict, because it is violence against mankind and Mother Earth. And I myself, as a victim of war, I'm a war baby. I was born posthumously. My father fought as a guerrilla captain against the Japanese occupation. I used to cry looking for my father as long as I remember. And my mother would always console me, "Don't cry, your father died so that you would be born free." The legacy of freedom, of fighting for everything that is God-given. We were created free. We must sustain that free will of choosing what is right. But we must keep inclusive, human rights-based, lifelong learning, so that the values, in order to keep peace and sustainable development, to care for our Mother Earth, which is the womb of life, which we must not destroy, depends on youth action now, so that you have the security of your future, so that you can have your families enjoy the wealth of your natural resources, as well as the richness of your cultural heritage. We feel very connected with Colombia because we are a Catholic country. We were colonized like the Spaniards. We have common Hispanic roots in a way, but we are struggling for our indigenous heritage to really be part or be the spine of our cultural identity, and working in cooperation with all countries so that we can have a peaceful global community. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias a nuestras conferencistas por sus intervenciones. Ahora queremos saber si alguien del público tiene alguna pregunta. pasaríamos un micrófono si alguien quisiera participar. Están tímidos. ¿Sí?
Buenos días, ahora sí. Gracias. Buenos días. Además de utilizar el método pacífico para llegar a la paz, ¿cuáles otros métodos podría utilizar usted?
De nuevo. ¿Además de qué?
Además de ser pacifista, ¿qué otros métodos utilizaría usted para llegar a la paz?
Usually, a method, is designed around the issues. What are the issues? What we often see is because we have a lot of inequality, there may be an issue of inequality that causes the problems in the community. So peace is about everyone being satisfied, everyone having access to basic necessities of life and so on. But one way for a community to forge unity, to come together, to build a community spirit. And today we are looking at a global community, not just a community in Colombia, but a global community, because we all have similar problems. And if we all come together, like in South Africa, where the whole world helped South Africa. And so South Africa can't say that it fought and liberated itself just by the work that was done in South Africa. There were many anti-apartheid organizations all over the world in many countries. So what we are saying is that to come together, you can, have cultural exchanges, have cultural shows where people can come together and share their experiences and share their, music, dance, drama, share their artwork and so on, because those are the ways in which people express themselves. For instance, here in Colombia, I had heard recently when I went to visit Medellin that the person who actually wrote the Colombian national anthem was in Colombia, and he was in an institution for mental illness. But he was the person who composed the national anthem of Colombia. So there are people in the country who are, who have many talents, and those talents have to be brought out. And when we bring those talents together and share them, we can build a common nationhood, which will firstly, you start with your neighborhood, Then from the neighborhood, it becomes a country. From the country, it becomes global. So I think that that is one of the ways in which we can bring about peace, understanding, and innovatively begin to change lives of people. Because through culture, you can also earn a livelihood. And that livelihood can help you change your life and the life of the people around you. So those are some of the ways.
It's okay. I'll follow up on Madame Ella's point. You know, there is a lot of ignorance, there is a lot of misconceptions, and media is one of those sometimes responsible. When the people feel excluded in the images that are presented by media, if, for instance, in our country, for a while, they look down on our indigenous communities. There are occasions where they make them the butt of jokes. There is no real appreciation of the history of the indigenous community that is so helpful for our people to appreciate them. For instance, our Muslim community has a hero like Sultan Kudarat, who is not known in the schools, even our parents, even I think our political leaders. They just know that there was a Sultan Kudarat. But Sultan Kudarat, actually, unknown to people, was ahead of the give me liberty or give me death kind of speech in the Gettysburg Address. He stood up against the Spaniards, gathered all of the different Muslim groups by the lake, and that's why Mindanao could not be occupied by the Spaniards. So this is unknown. We developed them into dramas, we asked media. I keep a radio drama, it was in television, but it's too expensive. But the broadcast reaches millions. Like now, we are, about 300 people here. But if we are broadcast on radio, and now there's TV taking it, and it will be multiplied, then you reach all the other sectors, the masses. They have to begin to be informed and to understand and to appreciate and to infuse the values that are necessary so that you can fight poverty. Unless you help lift up the marginalized from their condition of poverty, they will be feeling oppressed, isolated, angry, desperate, and it will breed conflict. So you have to be messengers of peace. You who are students and are informed can have, I don't know if you have this program called OJTs or outreach program. You should be the sensitizing forces going out to the poorer neighborhoods and sharing as part of your curriculum markings. So there are many ways. And now, not just Colombia, but the Philippines has become branded with drugs. The future of our youth is destroyed by drugs. More crimes, more horrific murders, robberies occur just out of these stupid drugs that people think you can feel high, and you feel high by caring, by being gratified that your neighbor is, living in dignity and not in the slums. If you can by yourself, really build this spirit of empathy, of caring. When I watch That's why we like to use the theater, because it builds empathy. You can suffer with the person you're seeing that is suffering. You can feel happy when they are happy, and you're not being jealous and want to destroy somebody who has a good fortune. It is a question of values, and I'm glad there will be some interfaith dialogue following, because cultural, spiritual synergy is important to build the mindset. You know, you can change the world. A lot of people think you can't, but you can change the world. Yes, we all can change the world if it begins with you and me. So, know you are a force. Believe in it. Be the messenger of peace. That's the key. Use it in schools. Don't just say, oh, the United Nations declared a Mandela Day. Ooh, no class or something. What is it in the mindset or in the life experience of Mandela that you can learn about the value of education for all? What is it in Mandela that you can learn about respect and equity of the rights of man? So when we have a day, I will tell you there is a bias or prejudice against some of the Arab communities in the Philippines. How are we helping it? I don't have guns, but I have a radio broadcast where the place of Palestine, of Jordan, of Saudi Arabia, of Egypt, that the ordinary people doesn't know, is able to be brought to their listening capacity so that they know, hey, they are as human as we are. They're not, horror people, but instead you feel that there is a commonality. Then you don't go to war against a friend or somebody you know. So you have to build that among yourselves in your mindset and spread it. It is important. You are accessible to social media. Share what you know, share what you understand, and contaminate people in appreciating or ending violence against mankind and Mother Earth. Thank you.
Agradecemos mucho a nuestras conferencistas por habernos deleitado con esta disertación y a todos ustedes por estar atentos. A ellas las invitamos. ¿Todavía hay preguntas? Muy bien, estamos animados a participar, excelente. Ya nosotros entregamos, ya los voluntarios estuvieron entregando algunos papeles. Esperamos que a partir de la segunda conferencia ustedes por favor puedan anotar allí sus preguntas y las vamos a ir recogiendo y las vamos a agrupar. Es muy probable que la pregunta de ustedes de muchos se parezca y cuando uno se responda a una pregunta se puede responder la de varios. Pero para darle continuidad a este panel y para finalizar, esperamos que una persona pueda participar con una pregunta más. Acá levantaron varios la mano. ¿Alguien, por favor? Vamos a llevar, le estamos compartiendo a ustedes el micrófono.
Hello. Ms. Alvarez. I'm going to make the question in English, so you don't have to. Cartagena is sadly a city with high levels of violence, of poverty and corruption, and inequality especially. If inequality and corruption can cause violence in a city, which policies could be used in a city like Cartagena in order to avoid high levels of violence?
avoid. So what kind of policy we can use to say like that?
Cartagena has a problem that's violence and corruption.
Si te entendí bien, la pregunta que nos haces es que en una ciudad como Cartagena, donde hay pobreza y corrupción, ¿qué tipo de políticas públicas debemos utilizar para ayudar a corregir esta situación? ¿Es eso tu pregunta?
Sí, sí, esa situación, si la pobreza y la corrupción son causales de violencia para ella, ¿qué políticas se pueden usar para evitar el surgimiento de violencia en una ciudad como Cartagena?
Perfecto.
Well, the first thing is that there should be a very strong judicial system which immediately looks at corruption and is able to deal with it through the justice system, judicial system. That's the one thing. The second thing is often we have corruption at the political level. And that corruption can be stopped if there is a strong civil society. Now, we often talk about democracy, but what kind of democracy do we want? You know, there is a democratic system in the West, in Britain, in America, and in other countries. But when the community goes to an election once in 5 years or 4 years, whatever the time period, and after that, that community has no power. It has representatives in government who don't come back to you until 5 years later, and then they ask you to vote for them 5 years later. Now, that kind of democracy should be shunned. We don't want that kind of democracy. A real democracy is a participatory democracy where people can participate from day to day. You have elected a representative to Parliament. That representative must come and report to you on a regular basis to tell you what's happening in Parliament, what are the laws, the policies, and so on that are being taken into Parliament. And that representative must listen to the experiences of the people. So the people can tell that representative that, look, money that was allocated for us, for building houses for us, has been channeled into something else by corruption. Then that representative takes that message to Parliament and deals with that issue in Parliament, because Parliament is supposed to look at the executive. The executive is the arm of government that carries out the responsibilities that the Parliament gives to it. So when they don't carry out those responsibilities, they are answerable to Parliament. And the parliamentary representatives are responsible to the people. So the people must be strong and hold their representatives accountable. If they don't hold their representative accountable, then you have all kinds of corruption. That is corruption at the government level. At the community level, you also have corruption, and that corruption can be dealt with by a strong judicial system, which will immediately detect corruption and hold the person accountable through the courts of law.
Yeah, I totally agree with what she said, but sometimes we say justice delayed is justice denied. Like in our situation, we almost felt that justice was being denied if the Marcoses or the dictator's family just went out. But now, finally, a decision was made. So, still, it is a celebration. the corruption also happens in the justice system because the salary is low, or, for some of the judges, they feel that it is not sufficient for their persona to live, or so they accept bribes. And so you see that the rich can get away with murder or even thievery because the judges were not with integrity. So you have to make sure that you have a mature electorate. In our country, what I fear most, and we need to have voters' education, is that they will vote for who is popular. Oh, the movie star, I see him. Oh, he's cute, or etc., or he sings well. So it is not the expertise, it is not the commitment to service that becomes the standard in the election. So it is so important that the young people, you who can be discerning, should be able to vote correctly. Those who will serve you well, those who can listen to your appeals, your cries for need. And you must be consistent. You must be able to be patient, persevere, never lose your voice, say it anywhere, everywhere, use media, because politicians, they want the vote, will eventually listen to you. So that's, I think, what's important. Choose your public servants well. We were able to raise the salaries of judges because under the table, the judge will do something, and then the poor person that has been accused will be condemned, and the one who's really guilty can get off. And that's why we are after the dictator to return the money, because if they do not return the money, it seems that it's okay to steal big. You can get away with it. So it's important that there is punishment for crime and reward for those who undertake the true service for the country.
Sí, todavía existen preguntas en el escenario. Sabemos que todos probablemente tienen muchas preguntas, pero vamos a seleccionar solamente 2 preguntas más. Por acá nos va a acompañar a... Ella estaba primero y ella. ¿Cuál es ella? La niña que tiene la mano levantada. Acá la niña que tiene la mano levantada. Ahí está, mira. Vamos a responder 2 preguntas más, ya seleccionamos una y vamos a esperar la otra. Ya les entregamos los papeles y no se preocupen que apenas estamos en el primer panel, vamos a seguir conversando, vamos a seguir respondiendo preguntas. Lamentablemente a todos nos vamos a escuchar ahora, pero a lo largo del día vamos a seguir escuchando sus inquietudes.
Muchas gracias. Buenos días para la doctora Cecila Álvarez. Mencionarme 2 procesos y proyectos internos en el conflicto de Filipinas, Indonesia, que contribuyeron a la formación de paz a largo plazo.
Miren que les quiero decir algo muy chistoso, ya que estamos entre jóvenes, una infidencia. Nosotros tenemos estos maravillosos voluntarios que son los patines que nos ayudan en todo. No sé si entendieron la pregunta. Do you understand the question?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Okay. Not just Indonesia, but quite a number of the ASEAN countries as well for the peace process. Right now, we have just signed the BBL, which is the Basic Bangsamoro law, which had stopped right now the rebellion against the government of the Muslim MILF. It is the Muslim Liberation Front. And in order to have gone into these agreements, we had to have neutral countries. Let's say the way Norway also helps as a place for dialogue. Indonesia was certainly one of those who have offered assistance where the dialogue or meetings were being held in Jakarta or even in Bali. At the same time, it was continued also with Malaysia. And right now, we held a parallel arts event, both in our Senate and in a festival in a theater, of artists in performance from claimant countries of the conflicted China Sea or West Philippine Sea. There's a battle of who owns these islands, and there is an aggressor. China is being blamed and is evidently trying to take over some of these things. Right now, through the different ASEAN countries hosting the ASEAN summits, there is an effort to develop an ASEAN code of conduct so that the sea has a free access for everybody. Another thing is, as we said, there must be what you call back channeling or cultural mediation that we are undertaking. This is why, as we said, she mentioned the rainbow inclusiveness. We have proposed in the Manila Declaration, which is being followed through here in Cartagena under the leadership of Victor Sibek, that definitely, if we want to keep peace, the United Nations has entered with its Blue Helmet Army, and maybe you have some volunteers in the Blue Peacekeeping Army of the UN. We would like, with the UNESCO heritage and the UNESCO blessing, to develop, harness, mobilize artists, teachers, youth, and social activists to form the Rainbow Creative Army that will build peace, not by force, but by art and media. There are so many social ills that a country faces. You need a mirror, and the arts can provide it for you. A mirror to see the weaknesses, underscore the strength, to build an identity that is strong enough to be able to confront the social ills. It is an armor for you. It is a conscience for you. It is a memory bank. You know, it's so important to know your past as part of your action in the present and your plans for the future. We have a colleague here who was born out of the World War II problem with the Nazis. And Elie Wiesel, who was a survivor of the Nazi problem or the Nazi war, said when he built this monument or was a major force for this monument in Israel, he said, without culture, there is no civilization, there is no future. And therefore, you must have a sense of pride and rooting in the wealth of your heritage, because that gives you the spine, the weapon, the army, peacefully for you to fight any problem. whether it is drugs, whether it is climate change, whether it is terrorism. You have to have that sense of identity and sense of connectivity with all other countries, especially within your region. That is why we praise the SCC for trying to connect Afro-Caribbean, also with Asia, because we are a country with the same Hispanic historical experience. So I think that's a way to, whatever was the question with regard to Indonesia. Indonesia, certainly we appreciate all other ASEAN countries together being a regional force for peace. That is the issue. And that's what you're trying to do here with the Central and South American countries with the SSCC.
Just want to add. I just want to add one little point to what Cecile has said, and that is that, in every negotiation, there has to be some pressure on the oppressor to come to the table. Usually what happens is that the one party which is dominating just wants to keep that power and resists coming to negotiate with the other party. Now, how do we give power to the party that doesn't have power? How do we motivate the party that is in power to come to the table? So it's two things. We empower the ones that are sort of in a dominated position, and we motivate the one that is dominating to come to the table. And this happens when communities unite, when communities become strong. Civil society power is a great power which we haven't been able to recognize until recently. This is what Gandhiji talked about, the power of the people. The people have a lot of power. And if that power is channelized in order to bring those people who are holding on to power in order to dominate the weaker group, will come to the table when you get united and you show that you are now ready to negotiate, but also ready to bring down those people who are dominating. How do you bring them down is through various non-violent means, through boycotts, through marches, through demonstrations, through isolation. All these things can marginalize those who are dominating, and eventually through shame and a sense of seeing that now they are going to face defeat, to come to the table, to come and negotiate with the other party. So this is what we as civil society can do. And through the unity, this South-South unity, we can build up a strong Southern hemisphere unity, which would eventually also empower United Nations to be able to carry out its mandate of keeping peace in the world. It is not able to keep peace in the world at the moment simply because it is dominated by certain countries that have the veto power in the United Nations. And if we unite, we can also wield power in the United Nations, which will enable us to ensure that United Nations keeps that peace in the world.